Good evening, everybody, and thank you all very much for coming. A huge thank you to the RSA, which stands for the Royal Society for the Advancement of the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, for inviting us here for the second in what is becoming a series, which began last year with our talk, Transforming Public Space Sculpturally, which was a conversation with Holly Hendry. So the RSA is a society of public-minded people, and their mission is to encourage exchanges of ideas in order to maximize social impact across many fields of activity. We're in a very important room. It's called the Great Room, and it was designed by the Adam brothers in 1744. And for over 280 years, it's been a place of assembly and debate. And up above you and around you, you can see a beautiful series of paintings called The Progress of Human Knowledge and Culture by James Barrie. These paintings assert that art and culture are the foundations of human civilization. I think we can all agree that he was right. So tonight is going to be what we like to call a triangular discussion, which means that each person is open to ask everyone else a question at any point they like. So we'll follow a slightly unconventional format, and we hope it works. This is actually quite a rare coming together of women from three quite distinct fields in the art world. The commissioner, the artist, and the commercial gallery. The COLAB, Claire Mander, Hannah Gruy from White Cube, and Virginia Overton. So we're really convening at a point where what is known as the art world meets the real world, and it really meets it head-on in public space and in the world of public art. The catalyst for this conversation is a seminal work called Untitled, Chime for Caro by a seminal artist, Virginia Overton, at the world's only sculpture garden dedicated to the work of women artists, the Artist Garden, which most of you know. None of this would have come to pass without the deft facilitation of White Cube, which sees itself, I think, as an unofficial institution of sorts by this time. In terms of what we're going to try and do, we're going to try and dive straight into Virginia Overton's studio, into the making of chime. We're going to have a quick meander through her materials, some of her processes, and the importance of collaboration to her work. We really want to concentrate on the ways in which women artists are successfully reconfiguring these public spaces far and wide, especially through using unconventional materials, including sound, to give sculpture an expansiveness that it doesn't have in a single object. We're going to obviously be led into ways in which Virginia Overton in particular responds to the male canon through her works, her perspectives and her ways of crashing down the hierarchies. Then it's over to you to ask us questions, as many as you like, and then we can all have a lovely drink. So it took James Barrie 23 years to complete this cycle of paintings. We've got 60 minutes, so I think I better get cracking. In terms of introductions, I'll start with Virginia Overton, and I've been given this very small piece of paper, and I would just like to draw everyone's attention to the number of things that this woman has done reads like the credits of a Hollywood movie. And the really interesting thing about it is that actually she started very late compared to most artists and really only got cracking 20 years ago. I'm not going to go through all the things that she's done, but in relation to a few minor outdoor commissions that she's done, she's currently in the Artist Garden. She's shown at Hypermaremma in Orbetello, the Frist Art Museum in Nashville. Many of you will have seen her show at Goldsmiths CCA in London. She was part of the 59th Venice Biennale. She's shown at Socrates Sculpture Park in New York, the Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, and many, many others. She has a BFA and MFA from the University of Memphis, Tennessee, where she's from. Hannah, who has been working with Virginia for a very long time, is a director and artist liaison at White Cube. She works very closely with several artists, but I like to think not as closely as with Virginia. And she's curated many exhibitions at the gallery, including In the Shadow and Rachel Kneebone, Merce Cunningham and Robert Morris in 2021. She was part of the panel that selected 20 fine art graduates to feature in a White Cube online exhibition, Tomorrow 2021. She hopped over from Tate Modern, London, and Monitor Gallery in Rome. She's an ambassador for Hypermaremma, and which is a curatorial platform bringing art into the landscape in South Tuscany, which sounds fantastic. She studied art history at Bard College in New York and holds an MA in curatorial studies from Goldsmiths in the University of London. For those of you who don't know theCOLAB, it is an organisation, very briefly, that brings together people, land and art. We commission very large-scale, very complicated installations in sites outside the White Cube, unusual, overlooked places. We firmly believe that that is where art really belongs, where the public can encounter it without the reverence of a gallery or institutional space, because we believe that art is really a conduit for understanding the world as seen by the artist. So now we're going to move into the reason we're all here. Now, so this is the beginning of what you have just seen at the Artist's Garden, believe it or not. Virginia, what is this? Where is it? And how on earth did that become chime?
Well, the first chime I made was during COVID, you know, and I was alone. I lived in my studio at the time, so I spent a lot of time in there by myself, and these chimes sort of came about because I had so much material in the studio that I'd never done anything with, and I was wanting a way to organize it, so I strangely started weighing everything and realizing that these disparate pieces would often weigh the same thing. So anyway, there's just this process that happened. And I don't know, Claire Lilly is someone I've worked with before, and she's at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and said to me at some point, oh, we have this material here for artists to use, and wonder if you would come up and look at it, but she wouldn't tell me what it was. And so I was intrigued, so I went up, and she opened these 4 shipping containers, you know, like the crypt. I had no idea what was going to be behind the doors because she hadn't given me any, you know, lead up to it. So of course when she opened these up, they'd been there for some years already. I was super excited, and I had no idea what I would do. So I spent about 2 weeks at Yorkshire on the back of the grounds, like taking every piece out of these shipping containers. Most of it I could lift. Some of it was heavier than I could lift, but I spread it out across this big parking lot and started organizing it, again, in a way of getting familiar with the material. I spend a lot of time with material when I'm working, so I ended up with, I don't know, maybe 40 pallets like this, you know, just single layers where I could see everything. And then a large part of the Goldsmiths show that I did in 2022 came from that. And the chime, this is actually the process of making that. And so instead of, you know, combining the material, the steel material, with another steel object, I used pipe to, you know, I created this weight system for, you know, how many centimeters it took to equal out the weight of these objects, and that's why they're different lengths. But I really wanted to push that idea of it being a sound instrument. you know, and so it evokes, I don't know, a xylophone or a pipe organ or thing like that. But when I'm making sculptures too, I often think about other things besides the material. Obviously, material's really important to me. You know, I make sculpture out of a lot of different stuff, but sound and smell and, you know, color, the way it changes a room, all of those things are taken into account. Also, in this show, there was a lot of blue, which is interesting. But the sound with these I also like, because often, and this is the case at Artist Garden, you might hear the work before you see it, before you know what it is. You might think it's a church bell or music somebody's playing, but you know, you go up to the top of the Artist Garden and it's this object.
It certainly has really drawn people up, and you know, which is very important for a site that is essentially hidden. So it's been quite interesting from that point of view. Hannah, so what's it like working with an artist like Virginia, honestly, who you know, the perception of her work would not be someone that would fit easily within the commercial gallery, or the perception of a commercial gallery format, making lots of series of works which are very similar, predictable. I think there's not an element of predictability in Virginia's work.
I think one of the things that really drew me to White Cube as a gallery and a place to work was I felt that the gallery is quite rooted in conceptual and experimental practices since its beginning day. And so I think when a gallery and an artist start working together, it's always about trust, and you're each risking something by coming together. And I mean, everyone at the gallery, when we first started working with Virginia about 10 years ago now, we just always loved the work, and we knew that it was an experimental practice, that you tested boundaries, and that sometimes you would maybe break sculptures when you were working with them. Maybe, you know, you would make 5 different works before you finally figured out what the exhibition could be. We knew that there was this testing process in your making, and that's something we dove into. So, but when it comes to, so I think there's just that trust there from the beginning. But then,
so what is the role of, this has always fascinated me, what is the role of the gallery beyond selling?
Well, I think we have to balance the commercial side, the selling side. That's important. Virginia needs to make a living as an artist, but also to bring interesting projects, allow her space to create what she needs to create, make exhibitions that push her, and so it's always about that balance for any gallery. But part of this project in particular, when she called us from Yorkshire and said, "I found all this stuff. I need help. I need help," because it was, you know, these containers full of heavy materials, and you know, our reaction was to send one of our fantastic colleagues who is a technician and artist and maker who knows Virginia very well, to send him up there to work with her and to help her sort the materials. And that's the kind of support that we always like to, or attempt to have with our artists that we work with.
And so, and in terms of showing outside the gallery space, what this is actually for both of you, what drew you to want to show this work at the Artist Garden when we approached you?
I mean, I really love outdoor spaces and places that show sculpture and that offer these opportunities for people to view work and be with work and interact with it. It's part of the reason I made these series of chimes, was because I really wanted to make something that was like, yes, you can touch this sculpture, you know, yes, you can interact with it, and that, you know, often if you're in a museum or a gallery, you know the rules. You know, you're not supposed to touch anything. You're supposed to stay a certain distance away. But you know, I love the location. It's not, you know, necessarily on the beaten path, though, as you say, more people are getting to know about it. And also the perspective, because it's on the top of a building, you know, then people have different vantage points to see the work as they're coming up the stairs, or, you know, even to see the city when they're surrounded by artwork. So it's such a unique space, and it's like really exciting that you're doing these programs. I mean, I just think it's like so additive to the community there. I mean, it's great.
And I think for a gallery who work, I mean, White Cube, we work with 69 artists, and I think like to be able to find other spaces for them to test work as well, to test what happens inside a kind of White Cube modernist space, and then outside in an urban environment, in an open landscape, and see how these works change. I mean, that's for dealers, and that's also really interesting, and how dynamic a work can be. And I think, I mean, what I'm personally also interested in, I think galleries like White Cube can be a little intimidating to go into sometimes. When I was younger, I would be too scared to open those doors and go in. And I think, so outdoor, like artwork that can be outdoor is for everybody. And I mean, the gallery is for everybody, but sometimes people don't feel it is for them. So that's important for the gallery too, I think, to be able to help artists find that space.
And in this sort of reaching out into public spaces, Chime is actually one of, Virginia doesn't make that many series of works, but Chime is something that you have come back to and shown in various parts of the world. And really, it's very, I think, quite a strong part of the work conceptually to know that you have these chimes chiming in other parts of the world. When ours was installed, we had the chime that was in Rome, and then we knew that that was somewhere there being rung by someone. And I just thought this was a brilliant way to just reach out across these vast geographical spaces through sound and through just the idea of this. It's a beautiful idea.
Thanks. Yeah, the one in Rome that Claire's mentioning was made out of a motorcycle, a Ducati motorcycle, and I think one of the reasons I've let myself indulge in doing a series is that they are so different. The source of the material and the place that I'm making them really has an impact on what they become and what they look like visually and the way they sound. So this continuity of sound from here all the way to Rome, for example, because that one also is still installed. You know, the sound changes. It makes a different sound of
but the materials, because the Ducati is such a kind of cultural image for Italians, the Caro, the art historical legacy in the UK, so they're also really linked to where you show them.
Yeah. And you really are, one of the artists who's really reconfiguring these public spaces and bringing whole new dimensions to expansiveness, but also to resourcefulness, I think, in the way that you make things and the way you build things. But one of the materials that's really, I think, that, the way you use materials has been spoken about, and it is almost quite obvious. But what I hadn't grasped until I started working with you was the importance of sound. And you've used it in several occasions, including this installation, which is at the Whitney Museum of American Art, but also in my personal absolute favorite recent work, which is the Storm King Center one. But should we talk about this one? This other rooftop.
Yeah, this other rooftop. The Whitney, moved their building, and when they built a new building, they added all of these terraces, which was great. They were going to be able to do a lot of outdoor exhibits, but they hadn't collected a lot of work for outdoors because they didn't have that in the building. So they had a hard time programming it in the early days, and one of the curators, now the director, Scott Rothkopf, said, Virginia, can't you do something with this giant terrace? We don't have anything we can show. And they did have a budget, and originally, the show was going to run through from the spring into the early fall. And because this is a 5th-story terrace in the building, you have vantage points of it from the West Side Highway if you're walking on the High Line, which is just there behind it. From the street level, there are hotels across the street, and also the other levels of the museum. And so I really wanted to, one, use its natural qualities, which it was exposed to the sun every day, so the aquatic plants kind of came in that way, and also create this line drawing. The line drawing on the surface is actually from the windmills. Those windmills are aquatic farming windmills, and they pump air, and so they're actually meant to do that. And so I'm running the tubing under these black covers to create this drawing. So they would aerate the ponds, and aquatic plants need aeration in the water to grow well. So anyway, when that show was ending, I was donating the plants to a local aquatic plant botanic garden, and then Scott said, okay, we still don't have anything to put on this terrace. Can you do another show? And I was like, another show? I mean, it'd be basically a continuation of this, but the plants can't live in New York in the winter. So he said, it needs to be something different. And I was like, great. Do you have budget? He said, no. And so I was thinking again about the wind and what it does and how it could potentially create sound. So once we donated the plants, turned the steel tanks upside down, and now the air was pumping into these tanks, and I placed them so that they were kind of against the metal, and so they became resonators. So when the wind would blow, you'd have this like sort of a bass note kind of, but they all sounded a bit different too. So it was this thing that reacted to the wind, and you became aware of it more as you were out there spending time with the work.
And you made a recording of it as well.
Yeah, and then I actually worked with a musician who came and recorded the sculptures in the first iteration of this, and then in the second one, and then we made a record album, which was really cool. I'd never done that before. So yeah, it was very generative. Yeah.
And then this is really the Storm King Outlook installation, and this is a really poetic use of sound and distance, and the idea of bringing people together through a very, very simple idea.
Yeah.
Because people can talk to each other, so you can stand. How long is the? It
was a little over
5 meters.
Almost no. I can't remember if it was 400. It's almost 500 feet. So
it's that long.
Yeah, and this it's that long. It's in a field at Storm King where they still cut hay. That was part of the reason I chose this field, because I wanted to create a work that was in the landscape, dealt with the vastness of the landscape, but in this really delicate way, through just this line drawing essentially. And as the work was installed and was, in the landscape, the hay grew up, and that was the picture before. You could see where, the hay grew up so that the brass tube sort of hovered over the top of the hay. And then, as you were saying, you could stand on one end of it and you might not see the person you're with or the other people at the other end, because it dropped off this hill, but you could speak to them as if they were standing next to you in a very quiet tone. So it was creating a sense of intimacy in this vast landscape. And this is also, I think, interesting for our conversation too. A lot of the sculptures at Storm King are by male artists, and I was flanked by Richard Serra and Mark de Souveraud with these large, objects, these really giant objects, and so I wanted to kind of counterbalance that with this sculpture, and this was also temporary. So
But I remember at the time there was a great New York Times article about that. And do you remember who wrote it?
Oh, I don't, actually.
And the writer commented on the fact that there were these, mega sculptures everywhere, but this sculpture was the one that highlighted the landscape, was the most beautiful, the most, like people were really drawn to it and wanted to play with it, walk away from it, touch it. Not like the other ones, you do kind of distance yourself. I think that's what is so powerful about this.
And it's also very tender. It's a very tender invitation because it's not something you want to climb on or swing on. It's something, it's a handrail. It's like a guide through the landscape, and it's not asking you to go quickly or to go at any speed. It's very, very, it's very beautiful.
Thank you.
And when you said this was a temporary work, this is what it became. So, Hannah, you support these kind of because Virginia has all these approaches for institutional exhibitions. So, how do you kind of facilitate these large-scale interventions? Because presumably, as much as you'd want to, you can't possibly say yes to everything. And you must really want to.
Well, I think it's, first and foremost, because the way you work, reusing, recycling, readapting, repurposing your materials, with any large project that you do outside, I think that's an open conversation that you have thinking about, when the project comes to an end. So I think with Storm King, I feel like you were already thinking, what would it be next? What could it be next? And so when it came down, we shipped it to London, I remember, and there was actually a bird's nest in one of them. Remember that? You can actually see a lot of the bird markings on the top, which were very beautiful. We were talking about different ideas. Should we approach Yorkshire Sculpture Park? Should we do that? But because you had that upstate New York landscape in your mind, it had to kind of evolve and become something else. And I don't remember how, I think you wanted to try it first, right? This was sort of a test when you wanted to make a painting. Is that right? Do I remember that correctly? And then we photographed it. And again, the way that you kind of composed the sides coming out, it was kind of trial and error a little bit. You really had to move it around. But that was something we knew we could work with. It's still very, very heavy, and I think it needed a reinforced wall. But then you made there was a few offcuts, and you made a smaller one. So, there are ways to adapt. And then we can place that with the collector. And that was kind of how this one worked. And you also made another piece where I think on one of the gallery walls, one of the brass tubes fit perfectly diagonally across the wall. So you kind of wedged it in, and then that was just such a gorgeous gesture as well. So you did a lot of different things after that.
And so, while we're on the topic of reusing materials, actually Caro's is not the only artists whose materials you have used, or I think it was said last night, scavenged, which I thought was, it was accurate, but, quite methodical.
As a person who reuses a lot of material, it comes from a bunch of different sources, and these are some people, some other artists that I've gotten material from, but I didn't always know where it was coming from. With the Caro steel I did, because Claire told me, Claire Lilly told me, but when I used some Dan Graham two-way glass, I had no idea it was his, and in fact it was at this exhibition in Munster, and he had done one of the sculpture projects some years before, and the Kunstverein for some reason just had a couple of pieces in their storage, and of course I'd gone to this museum and without any work in hand, I was just making it all there. So they let me go into the basement and I started pulling things out. I went through first and I put sticky notes on all the things I was interested in, and they told me yes or no, yes or no. And so I just, when they told me yes, I could use this glass, and I used it, and then when the show was coming down, I gave a lot of the material back to them. There were a few things I wanted to keep, and there was one of these sculptures that I wanted to keep, and they were like, oh, actually, you can't keep that. And I was like, why not? And they said, oh, that glass belongs to Dan Graham. And I was like, why did you let me use another artist's material, you know? So often, you know, again, there's still that continuation, even if I'm not using it. But these materials last also, so that's why they're also still around, you know, in part. The steel from De Souvero or Caro.
But it's also like I mean, you know, it's quite a sort of powerful, if inadvertent, answering back to this male canon of established, especially sculptors who, you know, sort of tend to weigh down the debate a bit. Can I ask you about how White Cube is taking on male canon?
Well,
and
well, actually, I was speaking to my colleagues about our the number of female artists we represent, because I hadn't you know, gone through and counted, but almost 38% of our program is female. We work with only 9 female sculptors. 16 male sculptors, so that was an interesting bit of research to find out, because I thought it was more female sculptors. I think we are a lot of women that work in the gallery, and we do. We are constantly. I mean, I can't say that we are only looking at female artists to bring in the gallery, but we are very drawn to a lot of women artists. But we work with a lot of very strong female artists, Virginia, Tracy Emin. I mean, we have very, very loud voices in the gallery too. And I think, I mean, we are looking to bring up our percentages for sure.
But maybe not to the extent of Cecilia Alemani in
I don't know. I have some colleagues in the audience. Maybe they can comment later. Maybe.
Yeah.
But not. Yeah. This was.
Which was a very extraordinary moment, because it contained over 90% women and gender non-conforming artists, and it was actually the first time in the history of the Biennale that women outnumbered men in the main halls. And this is what Virginia Overton brought to Venice, which, I mean, it's quite difficult to get a feel for the scale of it, but it's massive. It's 6 meters tall, and incorporates glass and obviously reinforced concrete and brass, the glass having been made locally in Murano. So what happens to a work like this afterwards, and where do you draw the line on the storage, recycling, rehoming?
Well, so when Virginia, I mean, we could talk about this together.
Yeah.
When Cecilia came to you, I know that you had discussed with her a few ideas of what you wanted to show. It was always going to be outside.
Yes.
What you were going to show. And then when you had this proposal, I mean, the first thing I think was you called White Cube and your gallery in New York, because for a lot of projects for the Biennale, the galleries support and help most of their artists when they can. And so it was really a kind of joint effort between, well, actually 3 galleries and yourself to fabricate this and help bring it to Venice with the Biennale. But I mean, I don't think we knew what we were going to do after. I mean, the Biennale is how many months? 6 months. So we had 6 months to sort of, you know, figure out what you wanted to do with it next, if it could come apart, because it's also about the logistics of that, you know, this thing is very heavy. It requires a special crane.
Well, Theoretically, it's a simple piece to move around, and it's not. But it's not. I mean, it is quite heavy. But these are components of tunnels, you know, that are used for driving through or running cables and electrical or water through. So there was for me, in part, it was that I wanted to make something modular that could then become quite large in the landscape. And this is one of the complications, and I don't know, this is maybe a question for you to ask, is that sometimes working in the landscape is daunting. It's hard to make something that you feel is big enough or has enough presence. It's why I think it's interesting the brass tube for me did that without being this big heavy thing. This, even though it is a big heavy thing, you know, I call it a tulip, kind of looks like that. It's a little bit of a point back to the architect Saren, and also made the tulip tables. But So it was the idea to make something modular that was easy to ship, and then just through conversation, I've learned about the Hypermarema project. You know, actually Hannah lives in that area part-time too, so there was an opportunity to show it in a very similar landscape, you know, near the water with a kind of architectural reference. You can see here, this is in Venice, and part of the architectural reference is all the arches, but there was also this very large crane, actually that used to be made here, called an Armstrong crane. They don't make them anymore, but so I liked that this big thing also felt at home in these different places. Yeah.
But I think that was, we didn't want to store it after, because it was tricky to move around. Getting things in and out of Venice, anything in and out of Venice is difficult.
And what about?
And it has to be out in the world too.
Yeah. And what about? How did you react to that one? Would you also classify that as one that's easy to ship in your?
Well, you know, this one for me was originally gotten out of the desert in the United States, and it's roof trusses, so they're prefabbed roof trusses, and this too is modular, but still large. So yeah, I don't know.
There's a lot of I mean, what Virginia gets the gallery to do, which I love, is we got to get creative, you know? I mean, we work with fine art shippers, fine art insurance, and maybe it's really nice to kind of break some of those rules sometimes to move a lot of the work around. And so I think, we have to be, we get to do that with Virginia. So also, I think maybe we ship this as trusses and not as a sculpture. You know, there's certain.
This was just going locally, but it was like a one-woman parade. It was so intense, and you know, it really brought the kid out in me. But also other people driving by, honking, and you know, wondering what on earth are you doing?
I think that's also your materials. People can really relate to them, and I think that they, you know, with the trusses or with the tunnel arches, I mean, people knew exactly what it was and why is it in this form, and it really makes people look at both art, sculpture, and regular everyday materials in such different ways.
But also, I mean, I think the sort of movability or not movability of your work does sort of play into this, you know, your really, you know, brilliant idea, which is actually very flexible and very resourceful and very pragmatic, actually, which is that work doesn't need to be specific to a site. It is related to a site, but that doesn't preclude it being relatable or fitting in another site. And you talk a lot about fitting, which is indeed where some of these or versions of these works have ended up. But there's also an open-mindedness in where you show your works. And there's a flattening of the hierarchies of these institutions, which you do in a very, again, a very poetic and a very approachable and a very kind way, but you make the point very succinctly.
Thank you.
Very elegantly. So can you just talk, what are these?
Yeah, these are light boxes, and they're fashioned after cinema marquee. And the first one was the kitchen that's in the top left. So that's a institution in New York, and they didn't have a sign on the facade of their building. But one of the things I do when I go to places is I often dive into the archive of these places. I want to see things that have come before, things that maybe they've never reproduced, you know, ephemera. And so I came across this little tiny photograph of this building, the facade of this building, with a sign that said the kitchen. It was a cinema marquee, but they didn't know where it was, what had happened to it. So I decided to remake it for my exhibition there. It was in the show, and when the show was over, I gave it to them as their sign. So then I just, you know, it is really important to me that I come to all of these different opportunities with this same energy, and this is a way to remind myself to do that. And it's sort of often the starting point for these exhibitions where I'll make the sign before I go and make the show. And no matter if it's a big place, a little place, a place that's been there for 100 years or 10 days, you know, the idea is that I always come fully engaged as much as possible, and that this is the thing that helps me do that.
Maybe it's a little bit like the way that you sort of tease certain properties out of your materials, like bringing sound to reminding people that an old metal pipe has sound, mm-hmm. or I guess this is highlighting the kind of the architecture of the institution too. It's also, or the building, or it's kind of like reminding people of this place itself rather than like the show that's in it.
Right,
too.
Yeah, that you're walking into this place.
Yeah.
Just a sort of dot on the map, you are here kind of thing.
And it's just, I think it's just a great way to create there's continuity between the Whitney and the kitchen. I think it's a great endorsement for all different levels that people work in the art world, and how, all the energy that goes into it. So I think it's a great thing to do. And while we're on the topic of signs, just to finish up, this is the latest sign that Virginia has had her eye on. Not only has she had her eye on it, she has done this and this in this place to this sign, and she has made it into something a bit like this, which I thoroughly encourage everybody to go and see, which is showing at the moment at White Cube. And only when you see the show, because this does not do it justice, will you fully understand the reason why she put inverted commas around the title of the show, which is Paintings.